Welcome to Recalibrate Reality, the future of New York. Our guest today is Reshma Saujani, the founder and CEO of Girls Who Code, an international nonprofit that seeks to close the gender gap in the technology sector. Reshma is also the champion for the Marshall Plan for Moms, which is a plan to make America's moms the centerpiece for our economic recovery. In our conversation, Reshma explains how moms, especially moms of color, have borne the brunt of COVID-19. And the Marshall Plan for Moms seeks to address this impact through policies such as paid family leave, affordable childcare, and pay equity, as well as job training programs, direct payments to moms, and a plan to safely open schools 5 days a week. And so now, let's recalibrate reality with Reshma Saujani. Reshma, welcome to Recalibrate Reality.
Thank you, Scott, for having me.
It's great to have you here. So the show is a recognition that we're not returning to the world that we left pre-COVID, but we now have an opportunity to reimagine and ultimately recalibrate to create a world that is more prosperous, more equitable, and more sustainable than the one we left a little over a year ago. So Reshma, can you take a minute to describe what you were doing before COVID, your experience through the pandemic, and why you think we need a Marshall Plan for moms?
At the beginning of 2020, women made up 51% of the labor force. So we were the majority of the labor force. Today, our labor market participation is where it was in 1989.
Wow.
So it's only at our labor market participation is at 57% of women, right? So it's this dramatic decline of 30 years of progress in 9 months. And that's just terrifying. So I have been fighting and building a national movement called the Marshall Plan for Moms because I both witnessed and experienced this havoc. So Scott, I started 2020. Girls Who Code had a Super Bowl ad. We were in the best place we had ever been. I was had a newborn son that I had had via surrogate. So I was just so thrilled to take maternity leave for the first time and just bond with my new baby. And a couple of weeks into his life, COVID-19 happened. And I was homeschooling my 5-year-old. My maternity leave had ended because I had to take care of my baby. And I was trying to save my global nonprofit from havoc because when pandemics hit, the first resources to go are to women and girls. And I got COVID-19, but it barely registered. My liver failed. I got acne on my face as if I was 16 years old. And when I looked on my Zoom screen, every woman looked exactly how I felt. And so many of us in the beginning of the pandemic, we were just grinning and bearing it. We're like, the schools will open in September. The schools will open in September, and then we'll be able to take a breath. Well, the schools never opened. And with 2 weeks of notice, we found out that we were going to have some thing called hybrid learning, where a default caretaker was going to have to log on their child at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, all the while maintaining their full-time job. And the scary part of this was that they just never even thought about us. As policy leaders calculated the HVAC equipment, calculated how to keep teachers safe, they never thought about what the economic implications were going to be on the people who are responsible for taking care of these kids. And so you saw this dramatic decline of women in the labor force. And so I thought, Scott, like, where's the plan? Like, someone's got to have a plan. And the reason why this affected me or bothered me, or I saw this so clearly, was that I had spent the past 10 years of my life building Girls Who Code. And what we forget about gender parity in tech is that we were almost at parity in the 1980s. 37% of the technology labor force was female. But then as it became more lucrative, we pushed women out. And so now we sit at 20% on a good day. And so even though we put all these resources, all this attention, you can't get back to where you lost. It is so hard to gain back those jobs. And so for me, the Marshall Plan was this like sense of like, where's the plan? And, if you don't have a plan, here's what I think we should do.
You mentioned the schools, and as that was happening, I was thinking to myself, women always had double duty, right? They had to be their job and a parent, and now they had triple duty: the job, the parent, and a teacher, and the pressure that had put on women. And for me, I would watch as policymakers were talking about opening bars and restaurants and even office buildings, and yet the efforts weren't made to open schools. And I think that The reality is, when you really think about public policy and we look back with 2020 hindsight, I wonder how people are going to feel about the efforts that we could have made to safely reopen schools and the impact that we've had in women in the workforce and, frankly, kids who have missed those opportunities. When you reflect on that, particularly in terms of the policies that we didn't execute, and now thinking forward as we're hitting the summer and then the fall, what do you think we could have done better, and what do you hope we do as we move forward on the school front?
Yeah, so look, I mean, I think that two of the reasons why you saw this decline of women's labor market participation was one, we don't have affordable childcare. And so when schools shut down and you couldn't bring in your parent, or daycare centers were closed or shut, you had no options, right? But to take the third shift, go on food stamps, move in with your parents, or move into your car. And 70% of low income families are run by a single breadwinner, often a woman of color. So when she loses her job, the whole family suffers. The second reason why you saw this decline is that many women found themselves in industries that just weren't pandemic proof, like retail, education, healthcare, jobs that simply weren't coming back. And so it was a huge eye opener that there are a whole set of things structurally that we didn't have in America that we needed, to not have this situation happen. So the first thing I think we really learned is that the importance of cash payments or basic income payments to mothers. Every mom I know, her situation wasn't the same. Some people, because they had to supplement their paid labor for unpaid labor, didn't have the cash to pay the rent, didn't have cash to put food on the table, didn't have cash to pay for a tutor. And so the idea of putting cash in women's hands to allow them to make the decisions that they need to make for their family was so critical at that moment. And we'll talk about how the child care tax credit, is a down payment on this. The second thing we saw in this pandemic is that we're a country that doesn't have paid leave, one of the few countries in the world that doesn't offer this. Not only would we have saved so many lives if people had paid leave back in January and February, it was not having paid leave and these benefits, and including affordable childcare, these structural deficits, I would say, in our care system that pushed women out. The other thing is, our failure to really think about how do you open up schools safely and to prioritize them instead of prioritizing the bars and the restaurants. And finally, it was really about thinking about retraining. Going back to the fact that so many of these jobs are simply not coming back. Well, what are we going to do? Because the primary breadwinner, was often a woman who were in those jobs. And so if we care about child poverty, if we care about poverty generally in this nation, we need to have a plan.
Your point on policy, I think, is critical because it's not going to happen naturally, right? These inequities are have been more pronounced because of COVID, and as the economy recovers, if what worries me is that they're going to be drowned out, right? Everyone's going to be, well, everything's better now, and even the Marshall Plan for moms, while there's a lot of rooting for it today, does that get drowned out? And so and you referenced sort of the Biden plan on some of these family issues like the tax credit, et cetera. Hopefully they will work. You referred to it as a down payment. What do you like about it? What do you think are some of the challenges that you would do different so it's more than just a down payment?
Look, I think that the Biden plan is a fantastic acknowledgement, right? Of that, to me, to be fundamentally American means that we take care of one another. My parents came here as refugees from Uganda. And when they came to this country, the Catholic Charities took them in. They helped my parents find housing. They got them situated, right? They had people in their community that supported them. But even for them, so many of these things were not affordable. Like I was a latchkey kid because my dad couldn't pay the $50 a week for childcare. And so we have had these problems for a very long time. And I think the American Families Plan is finally taking a step at addressing some of those. The data is clear. When you invest in kids at the earliest of possible ages, they live longer, they're healthier, they're more educated. So, having universal pre-K is critical. Making childcare affordable for so many families where it's not, because we don't have families that are marching up into the middle class. Getting paid leave done once and for all is critical. Going back to your question about the child care tax credit, to me, it's a down payment, right? On the Marshall Plan for moms. It's the first, and it's a really revolutionary, radical policy because, you get that payment regardless of whether you're working or not. So it is an acknowledgement of the unpaid labor and that this is important. We had 500,000 less births this year. If we continue to be a country, you know what I mean, where people don't think it's attractive to have children, that's deeply problematic. And when I talk to young women today, they don't want to have kids. They don't want to have kids because it's too hard. And we make it too hard. And so I think that we, again, have this opportunity to invest in families and I think change some of the structures that were just shown themselves to be so deeply broken that we've seen.
Yeah, no, yeah, to your point about how hard it is, the motherhood penalty, right? Which resonates with me. I grew up, I had a single mom, and I remember, her getting up at the crack of dawn so that she could do her schoolwork for her graduate before she went to work, then leaving dinner for us in the refrigerator when she was at a class late, and just, what women need to overcome to be successful. And then my daughter, who, interesting now, is my mom's age back then, 27 years old. I was having dinner with her the other night, and she was talking to me about having to make a decision between her professional career and being a parent. I walked away thinking to myself, why does it have to be one versus the other, right? And I think this is your point: is how do we not make this a binary decision? So, young women have the ability to have both.
And mom still makes 70 cents on every dollar. And when you look at the pay gap, the reason why it's getting smaller, but it's still there because there's a pay gap between parents. So there's a fatherhood premium. When they see you, Scott, and you're a dad, they think you're stable, responsible, committed to your job. They're going to give you more money. When they see me as a mother, in the workforce, all of a sudden I'm not as committed. I'm not as connected. I got other things that I need to manage. And so it's a penalty. And so there's literally a pay differential between moms and dads in the workforce. I worry that this pay differential is actually going to get worse now because what has been happening so long, especially in my generation, is the fact that we were hiding our kids. We weren't putting up our pictures up, on our desk. We weren't saying, "Hey, I got to go and pick up my kids from Little League." We were just juggling and doing it all, hoping that nobody would find out. Now, because of what happened this past year, you saw Sean interrupt me 10 times. You saw me have to navigate, and you saw dads. I mean, just the next 5 meetings you have, just pay attention. The dads never get interrupted. They're in a locked door, in a closed door. No kids are coming in. But for us, right, it's a completely different experience. And I just don't believe that employers look at me like, gotta hire a mom. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
No, especially now when you have less resources and you're oftentimes as managers, we're risk averse in terms of who we hire.
Yeah.
So we got to pay attention to this.
It's just as you think about, the inequities, whether it's racial inequities or, in this case, situation with women having inequities in the workplace, you got to be intentional. And I know, one of the things that we did at our company, we hired a woman to head our construction company, which in New York, construction's a rough and tumble business. And here we hired this woman. And what's been interesting to me over the years that she's done a terrific job at not only running the company, and building a great culture, but she's been a role model and a door opener for other women. And so we now have a construction company, probably with some of the most women in the industry that are out running some of the largest construction projects that are out there. And so I think you see that one way to achieve that, right, is to actually be intentional about hiring leadership in those roles. And that starts the process of changing that psychology that you were describing.
It is, Scott, but it's also about 86% of the unpaid labor is done by mothers. So, I married the most progressive feminist husband you can possibly imagine. And, in Indian families, which are pretty traditional, that's not easy. So, I was really picky, about who I was going to end up with. And, even in our marriage, I'm still like, you know what I mean? Like, do the laundry. And in this year, what I think so many of us thought, well, now you're going to see me do the laundry, take out the garbage, figure out where Froggy is, do all this stuff. And, things just didn't shift as much. Now, I also feel like I'm the lucky ones because I think my partner does more than most, but still. And part of the reason is because that labor is just not respected. Only 7% of American men take paternal leave. Think about that, 7%. Every company from Goldman Sachs to Morgan Stanley to Microsoft will basically just tout how an amazing company they are because of all these benefits that they offer parents. Well, what I want to know is Great, but what's the culture? Like if you're the manager who wants to hire the guy who goes to Little League, but then when he wants to take paternity leave, you all of a sudden make fun of him or gaslight him, which is what we know happens, then that doesn't change anything. So we can promote women all we want, but nothing actually changes until we shift culture around caretaking and parenting, and not just, and think about design. You know what I mean? Not just in the way that we design benefits. I mean, a couple countries got this right. You get 1 year paid leave. You both got to take it, use it or lose it. I want people when they're doing performance reviews to say one of the top things that you look at is, did you take your vacation days? Did you take your paternity leave? How much time did you spend with your kids? I'm serious. Like we really have to, if we really care about family, which we all say that we do, and it's a corporate value, then we have to really care about family. And so I think that this crisis has provided an opening for us to think about design. And I could go on and on and on about what I think too about how we design remote and flexibility. Because if you offer it to everybody, and it's only the moms that are taking it, because now all of a sudden our to-do list has gotten so damn big, and our partners are running away because they don't want to do the cooking, cleaning, and housework. And so they're in the office hanging out the water cooler, and y'all are talking about the other things you're doing, and we're not in the mix. We're actually, we're backsliding. So I see so much backsliding on equity when it comes to, and you got to remember, the vast majority of women in the workforce are women with children, are mothers. So when we talk about women in the workforce, you can't solve for equity unless you solve for the motherhood penalty.
Right. And I would think, and you alluded to this, this is a reset moment, right? And particularly in the workplace, and it is a time really, I think, to be advocating and active on this front, because we're all having to reimagine what work is and what the workplace is. And I use the workplace to mean physically or not physically. And there's going to be remote work, and there's going to be, some people that work 3 days a week, some people that work in the office 4 days a week, some people that work permanently from home, and some work permanently in the office. And so there is this opportunity, probably the first time in 50 years, where companies are going to take a step back and say, okay, we're resetting our culture. We're going to reset our process. And to your point, it is a moment where we can really address this equity issue more intentionally as part of that planning going forward.
I was a CEO during this global pandemic, and I was freaking out. Like, how am I going to meet my goals? How are we going to do our KPIs and offer flexibility remote at the same time? But we did it, and so I understand the tension and the fear. But I think part of it is the fact of, design, and how do we design it in a way that is actually going to give people genuine flexibility to get it done, and not simply mean that you're working all the time, and you're stressed. I mean, right now, I think everyone is going through stress and burnout phase.
Right.
And we're realizing that there's real repercussions of remote work and potentially flexibility because you're always on.
Yeah. And I think there's an issue that as we've lived through this period of time, people have lost a sense of community and values and support that the workplace had historically provided, that's not there right now. And then, as we're having this conversation about professional people that work in office buildings, but the reality is, a big part of the community that's suffering the most in terms of the women that don't have the choice. I mean, I know, with our own company, in terms of the essential workers, or you look at the local small businesses or restaurants that are out there. These are women that don't have a choice whether or not to come to work if they're going to get a paycheck and be able to care for their children, right?
Absolutely. I mean, women of color have been hit the hardest in this pandemic. They've lost, jobs at twice the rate of white women. And so, and it's been, unconscionable, the choices that they have had to make, because you're right. They don't, being able to not work is such a privileged perspective. Even, the vast majority of families in America, you need dual income earners. And so, so many parents have had to, I was talking to the LA City Council, and she had to organize daycare in the park. And moms just came and said, thank God, and just literally dropped off their kids because they had to go to work. They had absolutely no choice. I was just supporting a film that was about night daycare centers. There are moms right here in New York City,
Yep.
drop off their kids, at 9 o'clock, and they sleep there while they go to their fourth shift. So again, this is not right. We're better than that as a nation. No mom, no parent should have to make that sacrifice and that choice. And it doesn't have to be this way, right? And so, I'm a big advocate again about increasing the minimum wage, providing, quite frankly, universal childcare. I mean, when you make it a priority, when you make it part of who we are fundamentally, everything changes. And I think from the private sector, to me, it's like, how can you offer benefits to allow women to freeze their eggs, but you're not going to actually offer them benefits on childcare? It doesn't make sense.
Right. Yeah, no, and that makes, and you're 100% right as you make this point. And the, universal pre-K clearly has been one of these items that people have been able to see the benefits of it and now are supporting of it. And New York State, as an example, as part of this last budget process, has put funding in to do that broadly across the state. And that's one of the things that I think is important is, in changing culture and changing policies, sometimes it doesn't happen overnight, right? Sometimes you start by the example, and that example, is the glimmer of hope or the model that others build upon, going forward. And so, as I think for you about, coding for girls or the Marshall Plan for moms, these are those type of examples that are out there. Are there others that you can think of that we all can be taking the initiative on to help build models for the future?
Ironically, both To Girls Who Code and Marshall Plan for Moms, a lot of the models that I found that were working were in other nations, like in Estonia loves their mothers. You know what I mean? You almost get like 21 weeks of leave. Other countries have been thinking about, as I said, Canada and others, about design in terms of offering, lead. In Norway, when you have a child, you get diapers and milk delivered to you for the first 3 years of your life. And the vast majority of women go back to work. It's not even a thing. And, here, you don't even get maternity leave. Less than 1 out of 4 American workers gets that benefit. Think about it. How many women have a child and the next day go to work? That's who we are. That can't be who we are. It can't be. I used to be like, let's go to India. Let's go to other countries and see, their young girls. My mother's an engineer. Everybody in her class wanted to be an engineer. It was a cool thing, right? To be in science and technology and education and math. And here we had Barbie dolls that said, I hate math. Let's go shopping instead. We literally pushed little girls out of doing something that they wanted to do because of culture. And so to me, the good news is you can change culture. And we certainly did, with Girls Who Code. I'm just always moved by 10 years later, I can turn on Netflix and just see all these really cool nerds. It is cool to be a girl who posts today, and we did that because we focus on changing culture at the same time of developing programs. I think the same thing needs to happen with motherhood, right? We need these policies like paid leave, affordable childcare, the childcare tax credit, but we also need to change social norms. Like I said, cultures that are inside companies, that encourage encourage dads to take this leave. We need to change culture. Oftentimes moms feel like martyrs. We don't feel like we can ask for the things that we need. When I put out Marshall Plan for Moms, people on the right said, well, mother is a choice. You don't get any nice things. Too bad. You chose to have a child, so go deal with it. And on the left, it was like, well, wait a minute, we don't want to give moms money because then they won't go into the workforce. So it was, to me, I was like, we're thinking about this the wrong way, right? And so we have to almost refresh, redesign, reimagine motherhood so it works for
Yeah.
all.
And as you think about programs, one theme that's come up, and you touch upon it, which is actually directing dollars to the people, to actually where you're going to have the impact versus to bureaucratic programs. And I think one of the challenges that with some of these bureaucratic programs that are set up is they don't necessarily generate the results that they were set up to generate, or they're not necessarily measured. And then people lose confidence and faith in funding future programs. And I think this is one of the things that we've seen in some of the COVID response is getting the dollars to the people directly has the greatest impact. And that your point about having that go directly to mothers for childcare also seems to me to be the best policy.
Yeah, we're putting out a playbook, Marshall Plan for Moms at Work in July. And one of the things that we've been thinking about is, maybe Walmart should fully subsidize every single one of their workers, childcare. And that might be a better investment than putting, $1 billion into X, philanthropic effort. The data is clear. And so part of, I think, the reluctance of subsidizing childcare fully for their workers is that you weren't going to actually see the benefit of that until years. But now you know that the likelihood of seeing benefits is very high. So make that investment into your workers. But, I think President Biden says this right. We can't solely depend on the private sector. It's got to be the private sector and the state working hand in hand because, 9 out of 10 Americans think that they're in the middle class, but they're not. And I often, again, think about my dad and, they came to this country with $10 in their pockets in 1973 and as refugees with 2 degrees in education. They were in their 20s. My mother was pregnant with my sister. And, I know that he looks at me today and is so proud. And everything I've done is just the reflection of the American dream. No one loves this country more than my father. And I just wonder if he came today, would that have been possible? And I think we got to make it possible. And it's again why I've dedicated so much of my life towards educating girls who are under the poverty line and now supporting low-income mothers, because I really, Scott, believe in the American dream. And I really do believe that if you can, I see it with Girls Who Code, the amount of lives that we've changed, the amount of families whose lives have been changed. I mean, in the hundreds of thousands, it's possible, through education and through economic opportunity, it's possible.
The one thing that COVID did was it made more apparent for a lot of us the importance of government as a safety net, right? That we began to lose sight of that. And here you have this big public health crisis and, the economic challenges. It also, I think, took some of these social issues to many were bubbling below the surface, whether that was racial inequity or, women inequity, and made it more apparent to everyone. And your point on Walmart, it's actually comforting to hear a lot of private sector companies now realizing the importance of being part of the social solution, having that sense of social responsibility. And I think it's it's time to sort of renegotiate that social compact between what government does and what the private sector does, and form that partnership that you alluded to in your comments, if we're going to be able to move forward effectively.
Absolutely. And for the private sector to take the lead. Girls Who Code was, one of my first funders was, Jack Dorsey. And, he saw Girls Who Code when it was just an idea in my head. And so many people did, Beth Comstock, GE, our first companies were like eBay, GE, Google, and Twitter. And, they helped me teach Girls to Code before schools and university, we were talking about it. And so I think that the private sector can be a catalyst for equality and opportunity. And they have the opportunity to also take the lead. I mean, the private sector offered paid leave before the government has. I think that what's interesting though is that the holdup on paid leave are the business lobbies. So like if we were to do a redo, I would have asked those same CEOs to stand up and say, I'm doing it for my companies. Hey, government, you do it too, and continue to lobby and put the pressure. The same thing's going to happen on childcare. You're going to see innovative solutions happen in solving the childcare crisis out of the private sector. I hope so, and so whatever learnings and lessons and opportunities are there, we need to make sure that those same CEOs are standing up and saying to, Republican congressmen and senators and say, support this. And let's make this happen because it's good for the entire nation.
Right. Well, when you think about there's certain social responsibilities that have been pushed to the public sector that maybe, really the private sector should have been a cost of them doing business and hasn't been calculated. So whether that's, greenhouse gas emission, if you're using, if you're emitting carbon, there should be a tax, right? If you're not paying a fair wage, and to your point on minimum wage, then, and if someone goes into the welfare system, well, then that's being transferred to the public, maybe pay minimum wage. And I think the same thing about childcare, right? If you're going to be able to have the ability for everyone to have the capability to work, and not have the responsibility to also have the second job of taking care of the child. They need childcare, and if that's not being dealt with, that's a cost.
You work at Walmart and your employee says, I gotta leave. I gotta go pick up my kids from school. And I don't have childcare. And you fire her for that. And then she has to go on public benefits. Damn right. Like, you know what I mean? You should pay for that. So I think we got to think about and look at these things in a different light. Because I do think that the public pays a tax, or pays, for the private sector not acting in the way that it should in the best
Right.
benefit of its citizenry.
So, Reshma, you're a New Yorker. You love New York, like I love New York. New York has a big election coming up. We have a mayoral race in June, which likely leads to our next mayor. And so, if the next mayor, if he or she, reaches out to you and says, "Okay, you've set up some of these great programs," what would the three recommendations you would give me to ensure I can help provide, better equity for women in the workforce, as I set the policies up for this city? What would those three recommendations be?
Look, I mean, if we as we grow out of the devastation and what has happened to New Yorkers, I know that women in New York, especially low income women in New York, have been hit the hardest and they've been devastated. And again, we still don't have affordable childcare. We still don't have, we still don't value their unpaid, unseen labor, which, again, I think falls on so many women of color. So I want to see, New York City take the lead, in coming up with innovative policies to value this work and to support women who are so many of our city's breadwinners. The second thing I think that, and look for ways, where you can root out inequality. I know that, Senator Alexander Biaggi, proposed a bill in New York State asking for a task force so we can monitor and shorten the economic recovery for women. Under Obama, it took 8 years to get back from that recession. Women don't have 8 years, 10 years, 11 years, 12 years. We got to do it now. And so to me, I want to see KPIs. I want to see a plan. I want to see like accountability and how we're doing in getting women back to working, back to work, with middle class wages. The other thing that I feel very passionately about is, one of the things that I saw is that so many of my students were not logging on to school. We're not participating because they had to take care of their younger siblings. And, we have to have a two-generational strategy towards poverty reduction. We can't just simply be focused on kids and not be focused on moms. And we can't simply be focused on moms and not be focused on kids. And, because of the school closures over the past year, we've lost a generation of kids, and we have got to, I want to see a plan in the DOE on what they are doing to support the kids who lost a year of education last year. What is the plan? And what is the program and what are the services that we're going to be offering? And I went, finally, it is no longer okay for us to have a digital divide in the city. No longer okay. Every kid, every family should have high-speed internet that's affordable, and every kid should have a device that they can actually learn on. We've basically learned remote, how to do remote education in school. It's not going away. It's some version of it is not going to go away. And so it can't just be that you get to actually be educated because you are wealthy enough to have the internet and have a device, because we're going to further deepen the inequality amongst our children.
Reshma, this was really, really insightful, and personally, actually, for me, eye opening and hopeful. It's interesting. It's great to hear you advocate on such an important issue, and one, to your point, should be so obvious that it should be, a basic principle of how we all live our lives in this country. But beyond your advocacy, I really appreciate that you're actually putting out tangible recommendations and policies that we can measure our success against as we go forward, and have that sense of urgency in your voice, because this is a moment where we are going to recalibrate for the future, and it's the moment where we should recalibrate in a way that we have more equity going forward, and we resolve this inequity once and for all. So thank you for taking the time today and sharing your views.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful being here. And listen, I mean, I think we can take people from rage to hope. And I think at the core, we have to center mothers at the center of our economic recovery. And if we do, we will lift everybody up. I really believe that.
Right. Well, to all mothers out there, we're with you, and thank you very much, Reshma. Bye.
Bye.
That concludes this week's episode of Recalibrate Reality. As we have now learned throughout this series, in many ways, COVID was an accelerant, with 10 years of innovation taking place in a little over 10 months. But we've also seen how COVID has undermined years, if not decades, of progress for communities of color and particularly for women. If we're going to recalibrate and create a more equitable world post-COVID, then we're going to need bold policies like a Marshall Plan for moms. Thank you again to Reshma Saujani. Thank you to the Regional Plan Association and the 92nd Street Y. And thank you to the team for making this week's episode possible. From 75 Rockefeller Plaza in New York, I'm Scott Rechler. See you next week.